The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 10 Sovereignty Presence Without Defense. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, a mirror-linguistic hypothesis series, Volume 3, The Silencing Field Return to Self, and the final episode of the series, Episode 10, Sovereignty and Presence Without Defense. This episode does not begin with empowerment. It does not begin with independence. It does not begin with strength. It begins with something far quieter and far more difficult to recognize, the moment your nervous system stops preparing for impact. Sovereignty, as it appears here, is not a social position or a psychological stance. It is not autonomy as ideology, not self-sufficiency as identity, not resilience as performance. Sovereignty is a physiological condition in which presence no longer requires defense. Nothing inside you is bracing. Nothing is preempting. Nothing is organizing around threat. That condition is rare, not because it is extraordinary, but because most environments reward defense so consistently that defense becomes invisible. It becomes personality. It becomes maturity. It becomes what people call having your guard up, being strong, or knowing your boundaries. Volume 3 has been dismantling that confusion step by step. Stillness interrupted compulsive motion. Sensation returned a signal to the body. Orientation restored context. Discernment separated the signal from the noise. Boundary returned the edge without aggression. Voice allowed expression without performance. Agency restored choice without urgency. Reciprocity revealed timing in the field. Coherence stabilized participation without fragmentation. Sovereignty is what becomes possible when coherence no longer needs protection. To understand sovereignty at the depth required here, we must bring the mirror-linguistic hypothesis fully into the foreground. The mirror-linguistic hypothesis proposes that language is not primarily a system for transmitting information. It is a system for transmitting a state. Words, tone, pacing, silence, prosody, and timing act as mirrors through which nervous systems entrain to one another. Meaning follows regulation. Content arrives after the field has already organized itself around safety or threat. From this perspective, sovereignty is not something you claim through language. It is something language reveals when it no longer needs to signal defense. Most people use language defensively without knowing they are doing so. They soften their tone to avoid a reaction. They justify to preempt misunderstanding. They explain how to manage perception. They assert to establish safety. They withhold to avoid exposure. Every one of these linguistic strategies is a nervous system attempting to regulate threat through speech. This is not manipulation, it is survival. But survival language carries a cost. It keeps the nervous system oriented toward potential impact. It keeps timing out. It keeps the body prepared. Sovereignty begins where that preparation ends. This is why sovereignty cannot be achieved through assertion. Assertion is still a defensive act. It announces boundaries because boundaries are not trusted to hold. It signals strength because strength is needed. It communicates independence because dependence is feared. Sovereignty does not announce itself. It is felt first as the absence of anticipatory tension. When sovereignty is present, the body does not lean forward or pull back in contact. It does not tighten before speaking. It does not rehearse responses. It does not scan faces for reaction. It does not prepare explanations. It does not armor silence. Presence becomes neutral. Neutral does not mean detached. It means unthreatened. This is the key shift that distinguishes sovereignty from every identity-based version of power. Power asserts, sovereignty rests. From a mirror-linguistic hypothesis perspective, this rest is immediately audible. Language changes not in content, but in function. Before sovereignty, language functions as a regulator. It manages the field. It modulates response. It anticipates a threat. It corrects misunderstandings before it occurs. It fills the silence so it does not become dangerous. After sovereignty, language relinquishes that role. Speech becomes descriptive rather than preemptive. Silence becomes neutral rather than loaded. Pace stabilizes without effort. Words arrive when the signal moves, not when anxiety demands. This is not a restraint, it is alignment. Sovereignty is what happens when the nervous system no longer treats contact itself as a potential injury. To understand how rare this is, we need to be precise about what defense actually is. Defense is not aggression. Defense is anticipation. It is the nervous system preparing for an outcome that has not yet occurred. It recruits muscles. It narrows attention. It accelerates speech. It compresses time. It demands clarity now. Defense is not a flaw. It is adaptive in dangerous environments. But when defense becomes constant, the body forgets how to be present without bracing. Volume 3 has been restoring that capacity gradually. Stillness taught the system that it could stop without danger. Sensation taught it that feeling did not require collapse. Orientation taught that context matters. Discernment taught it to separate threat from signal. Boundary taught it to hold the edge without force. Voice taught it to express without performance. Agency taught it to choose without urgency. Reciprocity taught it to share timing. Coherence taught it to participate without splitting. Sovereignty is the final integration, the system realizing it no longer needs to defend its own coherence. This is why sovereignty is not separateness. Separateness is often a defense strategy. I don't need anyone. I rely only on myself. I stay unaffected. These statements sound strong, but they are often spoken from a threat. They are declarations made because contact still feels unsafe. Sovereignty does not reject contact. It no longer fears it. From a mirror-linguistic field theory perspective, this shift is profound. When a nervous system no longer broadcasts defensive signals, the field reorganizes automatically. Others may feel calmer or unsettled. or exposed. The absence of defense removes a familiar signal that many interactions depend on. This is why sovereignty can feel disruptive, even when nothing is said. But sovereignty does not correct the field. It does not manage reactions. It does not stabilize others. It remains present and allows the field to respond as it will. This is presence without defense. Presence without defense means you can be seen without preparing for how you will be seen. You can be misunderstood without escalating. You can be questioned without justifying. You can disagree without hardening. You can remain silent without strategizing. This is not passivity, it is stability. Stability here means the nervous system does not leave itself to manage the interaction. Language, again, is the clearest indicator. Before sovereignty, even silence is often strategic. Silence is used to withhold, to punish, to provoke, to protect. It is tense. It carries intention. It is a signal. After sovereignty, silence loses its charge. It becomes simply the absence of speech, not the presence of threat. This is an extraordinary shift because silence is where most nervous systems feel most exposed. Silence leaves room for interpretation. It removes control. It allows the other system to project. Sovereignty allows that projection without internal reaction. This does not mean projection has no impact. It means the impact is not treated as a danger. From an MLH standpoint, this is the moment language returns fully to its reflective role. Words no longer mirror fear, they mirror state, and the state is settled. This settled state is not numbness. It is not dissociation. Dissociation removes sensation. Sovereignty allows sensation to exist without escalation. You still feel the impact. You still feel emotion. You still register a difference. The difference is that none of these sensations is treated as a signal to defend. This is where sovereignty diverges sharply from emotional invulnerability. Emotional invulnerability is a defense posture. It suppresses feelings to avoid pain. Sovereignty does not suppress. It allows feeling to move without organizing around it. This distinction is crucial. Many people believe they are sovereign because they are unaffected. In reality, they are armored. Their nervous system has shut down responsiveness to avoid a threat. That is not sovereignty. That is withdrawal. Sovereignty remains responsive. From a biological perspective, sovereignty reflects a nervous system with low-threat neuroception in contact. The system does not predict harm simply because another nervous system is present. It does not default to fight, flight, freeze, or appease. It remains regulated while engaging. This is supported by stable vagal tone, low baseline sympathetic activation, and accurate interoceptive signaling. The body does not mobilize unnecessarily. It does not brace. It does not collapse. This physiological stability is what allows presence without defense. Without it, sovereignty becomes a concept rather than a state. This is why sovereignty cannot be willed. It emerges only after the nervous system has learned through repeated experience that coherence can hold under contact. Volume 3 has been providing those experiences conceptually and somatically. Episode 10 names what happens when the system integrates them fully. Language now becomes almost transparent. You do not speak to protect yourself. You do not explain how to remain safe. You do not assert to hold ground. You do not withdraw to preserve integrity. You speak when meaning moves. You remain silent when it does not. You act when the signal aligns. You pause when it does not. None of this is effortful. Effortlessness here does not mean ease. It means the absence of internal contradiction, and this returns us to the defining characteristic of sovereignty in this framework: non-contested presence. Historically, sovereignty referred to authority that was not being challenged, not because it was enforced violently, but because it was recognized as stable. That meaning has been distorted by modern power narratives, but the original sense matters. Sovereignty is a presence that is not being contested internally. When nothing inside you is arguing, defending, or preparing, presence stabilizes naturally. This is why sovereignty is the culmination of a return, not an ascent. You do not rise above the world. You return to yourself inside it. As we move through the rest of this episode, each section will deepen this understanding. We will define sovereignty. We will dismantle defense-based identities. We will map sovereignty somatically. We will observe it in live interaction. We will trace how language functions when defense dissolves. We will offer observation rather than instruction. We will integrate sovereignty without turning it into separation. But here at the opening, one truth must be held clearly. Sovereignty is not something you protect. It is what remains when protection is no longer required. If you can feel even a hint of that condition, the absence of bracing, the neutrality of presence, the quiet of language that no longer guards, then you already know what this episode is pointing toward. Not as an achievement, not as an identity, but as a state. The nervous system remembers when the threat finally releases its grip. The atmospheric hook: when you stop bracing, there is a moment that does not announce itself. No insight arrives, no boundary is asserted, no decision is made, and yet something fundamental changes. The body stops leaning forward. It stops pulling back. It stops holding itself in readiness for an impact that may never come. That moment is not confidence. It is not relief. It is not safe in the conventional sense. It is the moment you stop bracing. Most people do not realize how much of their daily experience is organized around bracing. It is subtle. It lives in the jaw that tightens before speaking, in the breath that shortens when attention turns toward you, in the slight forward lean when listening, ready to respond quickly, in the micro adjustments of tone, posture, and timing that happen automatically whenever contact occurs. Bracing does not feel like fear. It feels like readiness, like competence, like being switched on. And because it has been rewarded for so long, it feels indistinguishable from presence itself. So when bracing stops, the sensation can be confusing. There is no rush of calm, no emotional release. Often, there is a strange neutrality, a sense that nothing is required of you in this moment, that nothing needs to be managed, prevented, or prepared for. This neutrality is sovereignty beginning to be felt. Sovereignty does not arrive as empowerment, because empowerment still implies force. It implies pushing back against something. Sovereignty arrives as the absence of push altogether, the absence of the need to anticipate, to harden, to stay ahead of the moment. The first thing you notice when you stop bracing is that your attention returns to the present without effort. Before, attention was split. One part of you tracked the interaction, another tracked you inside it, another monitored for shifts in tone, implication, or expectation. That split was so familiar it felt like awareness. When bracing stops, attention gathers, not sharply, not intensely, gently. You are simply where you are. You notice this most clearly in the body. The shoulders drop without collapsing. The chest softens without closing. The face rests into itself without expression being removed. The eyes stop scanning. Breath resumes its natural rhythm, not deep or shallow, just unforced. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is precisely why it is easy to miss. For a long time, staying open required vigilance. You learned to stay open by staying alert, to remain available by remaining prepared. Openness became something you performed rather than something you inhabited. Sovereignty dissolves that performance. Staying open without vigilance is not naivete. It is not exposure. It is the body recognizing that openness does not require constant monitoring to be safe. Monitoring is exhausting because it keeps the nervous system in a state of anticipatory tension. It is the background hum of what might happen next that never quite switches off. Even in calm interactions, monitoring remains. It checks, it adjusts, it corrects. When monitoring stops, something counterintuitive happens. You become more responsive, not less. Responsiveness without monitoring feels different. You still register shifts, you still notice tone, pace, and movement, but you notice them as information, not as cues for immediate adjustment. This is the difference between being affected and being destabilized. Before sovereignty, being affected often meant being destabilized. A change in the other person's energy triggered a response in you. You adjusted, you compensated, you prepared, you moved to stabilize the field. This adjustment happened so quickly that it felt involuntary, and because it was effective, it was reinforced. After sovereignty begins to appear, you can be affected without reorganizing yourself around that effect. You feel the shift, you register it, but nothing inside you scrambles to manage it. This is not indifference, it is containment. Containment here does not mean holding things in. It means the nervous system has enough internal stability to let sensation move without triggering defense. Being affected without being destabilized is one of the clearest felt markers of sovereignty. Someone speaks sharply, you feel it. There is a brief tightening, a flicker of sensation, but it passes through without a recruiting strategy. You do not harden, you do not appease, you do not escalate, you remain. Someone misunderstands you, you feel the misalignment, but you do not rush to correct, you do not over-explain to restore safety. You allow the misunderstanding to exist without treating it as a threat. Someone looks at you intently, you feel seen, but you do not brace, you do not perform, you do not withdraw, you stay present in your body. These moments are small, ordinary, and yet they represent a radical shift in how contact is lived. The body no longer treats contact as impact. Impact implies force, it implies a collision, it implies something that must be absorbed or deflected. When you stop bracing, contact ceases to be experienced as impact. It becomes an interaction. Interaction does not require armor. One of the most striking sensations when bracing stops is the absence of urgency around response. Before, silence was often intolerable, because nothing was being said, but because silence removed control. Silence allowed the other person to move first, to interpret, to project. Silence was a gap that had to be managed. When sovereignty appears, silence becomes neutral. Neutral silence is not heavy. It does not demand filling. It does not imply anything needs to happen. It simply exists. This neutrality is deeply unsettling at first if your nervous system is accustomed to using language as a protective tool. Without speech to manage the field, you may feel briefly exposed. But that exposure does not escalate because nothing follows it. The moment passes, the body remains intact, and that is the learning. Sovereignty is not learned through insight. It is learned through moments that do not collapse. Moments where you do not brace and nothing bad happens. Moments where you remain present without defending and the world does not attack. Moments where you are affected and survive the effect. These moments recondition the nervous system at a depth cognition cannot reach. You begin to trust your capacity to remain intact under contact. Trust here is not belief, it is an embodied expectation. The body stops predicting harm where harm does not consistently occur. This shift has cascading effects. Language changes, but again, not because you decide it should. Words arrive later, often fewer of them, not as withholding, but as timing accuracy. You speak when something needs to be said, not to manage what might happen if you don't. Tone changes. It becomes less shaped, less strategic, less concerned with landing. Not careless, just unguarded. This unguardedness is often misread. People who are used to defensive signaling may experience unguarded presence as strange, too quiet, too direct, too still. They may look for the armor that is no longer there and feel unsettled by its absence. This is not your problem to solve. Sovereignty does not adjust itself to maintain comfort for others. It remains. Remaining without adjustment is one of the hardest things for socially attuned nervous systems to tolerate, especially for those who learned early that their safety depended on reading and responding to others' states. For such nervous systems, bracing felt like care. Care, in that context, meant preventing disruption, preventing discomfort, preventing misalignment, preventing conflict, preventing withdrawal. Sovereignty redefines care. Care becomes staying present without erasing yourself, without anticipating collapse, without managing the emotional weather of the room. This does not mean you stop being considerate. It means consideration is no longer driven by fear. Fear-based care is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance. It never rests. Sovereign care rests within itself. This is where the experience of sovereignty can feel almost anticlimactic. There is no rush of freedom, no sense of arrival, just a gradual recognition that you are no longer doing something you used to do all the time, that something was bracing. The body no longer prepares for impact in ordinary moments. It no longer tightens in advance of contact. It no longer mobilizes before a threat is present. Threat, when it does appear, is responded to appropriately. Sovereignty does not remove boundaries. It makes them precise. When danger is real, the body responds. When it is not, the body rests. This precision is what differentiates sovereignty from dissociation. Dissociation also removes bracing, but it does so by removing sensation. Sovereignty keeps sensation online. You feel more, not less, but feeling no longer equates to danger. This is a profound reorganization. Many people confuse numbness with calm because both lack agitation, but numbness is the absence. Calm sovereignty is the presence without agitation. You can tell the difference in the body. In numbness, sensation is muted. There is distance, a sense of being behind glass. In sovereignty, sensation is vivid but non-alarming. You feel temperature, pressure, emotion, and sound, but none of them recruits defense. This is why sovereignty feels grounded rather than flat. Another subtle shift appears in time perception. When bracing is constant, time feels compressed. There is always something next, something coming, something to prepare for. Even rest is edged with anticipation. When bracing stops, time opens slightly, not expansively, just enough to breathe. The moment you are in feels complete in itself. You are not leaning into the future or clinging to the past. This temporal settling is deeply regulating. The nervous system is predictive. It constantly forecasts what will happen next. When predictions are dominated by threat, the system stays mobilized. When predictions soften, the system relaxes. Sovereignty softens prediction without eliminating it. You still anticipate, you still plan, but anticipation no longer dominates experience. It becomes a tool rather than a posture. This change is felt as a presence without effort. Presence is often taught as a practice, something you cultivate through focus or discipline. But presence here is not cultivated. It emerges when defensive prediction drops. You are present because nothing is pulling you away. This is why sovereignty cannot be forced. You cannot decide to stop bracing. You can only notice when bracing is unnecessary and allow the body to learn that. This learning happens in contact, not in isolation, not in theory. In small moments where you remain open without vigilance, and nothing breaks. Those moments accumulate, and slowly, the nervous system stops assuming it must protect itself from ordinary interaction. This does not make you invulnerable. It makes you proportionate. Proportionate response is one of the hallmarks of sovereignty. You respond to what is actually happening, not to what might happen. You meet intensity with intensity when needed. You meet calm with calm. You do not escalate prematurely or suppress unnecessarily. This proportionality feels like sanity. It is sanity restored at the level of the body. Sovereignty feels like nothing needing to be defended. No self-image, no boundary narrative, no emotional posture, no identity position, just presence. As this episode continues, we will begin to name sovereignty more explicitly. We will define it carefully. We will distinguish it from the many things it is not. We will trace how defense became identity and how that identity can soften. We will map sovereignty somatically. We will observe it in interaction. We will let language become almost transparent, but for now, remain with the feeling. The quiet moment when you stop bracing. The neutrality of silence that does not threaten. The sensation of being affected without destabilization. The ease of staying open without vigilance. That is sovereignty announcing itself not through power, but through absence. The absence of threat where threat no longer exists. Etymology and definition of sovereignty. What is sovereignty? Sovereignty is one of those words that sounds powerful before it is understood. It carries weight, authority, finality. It is spoken as if it were a possession, something you either have or do not have, something that can be claimed, defended, or taken away. In modern usage, sovereignty is almost always framed in terms of power, who holds it, who loses it, who enforces it, and who violates it. That framing is precisely what obscures sovereignty at the nervous system level. To stabilize this concept for this episode, and for the completion of Volume 3, sovereignty has to be stripped of its ideological inheritance and returned to its functional roots, not as a political abstraction, not as a moral ideal, but as a state condition. The etymology matters here because language reveals how meaning drifted. The word sovereignty comes from the Old French souverain, meaning supreme, above, or highest, which itself derives from the Latin superanus, that which is above. Importantly, in its earliest uses, sovereignty did not primarily mean domination. It meant uncontested authority. Authority that did not need to be proven, because it was already recognized as stable. This is a crucial distinction. Uncontested does not mean unchallenged through force. It means there is no active struggle for control. The authority holds because nothing is attempting to displace it. It is not asserting itself. It is simply present. Over time, sovereignty became entangled with governance, territory, borders, and enforcement. Power entered the definition. Violence entered the definition. Control entered the definition. By the time sovereignty reached modern political language, it had become inseparable from dominance, independence, and the capacity to impose will. That shift mirrors what happened internally at the level of the nervous system. As external nervous systems became more coercive, internal systems adapted by equating safety with control. The idea of sovereignty migrated inward as self-control, emotional control, independence, and self-reliance. The sovereign individual became the one who could not be influenced, who did not need others, who stood apart, who remained unaffected. But this is not sovereignty. It is armored autonomy. To clarify sovereignty as it functions here, we need to draw sharp distinctions between it and the concepts it is most often confused with. First, sovereignty versus independence. Independence is separation. It is the removal of reliance. It is defined negatively by what is not needed. I don't depend, I don't require, I stand alone. Independence often emerges as a solution to relational threat. If contact destabilizes me, I reduce contact. If reliance feels dangerous, I eliminate reliance. Independence can be adaptive, but it is almost always defensive. Sovereignty does not require separation. A sovereign nervous system can be deeply connected without losing integrity. It does not need to stand alone because it does not experience connection as inherently threatening. Independence is protected by distance. Sovereignty stabilizes by presence. Second, sovereignty versus autonomy. Autonomy is self-direction. It emphasizes choice, agency, and self-governance. Autonomy asks, who decides? It is concerned with authorship and control over action. Autonomy is central to earlier episodes in this arc, especially agency. But autonomy alone is insufficient for sovereignty. You can be autonomous and still be defensive. You can make your own choices while bracing against reaction. You can act freely while internally preparing for impact. Autonomy without coherence still requires protection. Sovereignty arrives after autonomy has stabilized into coherence. It is not about choosing freely. It is about no longer needing to defend your choice. Third, sovereignty versus control. Control is regulation through force. Internally, control appears as suppression, inhibition, and override. Externally, it appears as dominance, enforcement, and constraint. Control is always a response to a threat. Even when it looks calm, control is tension held in place. It requires vigilance. It must be maintained. Sovereignty does not regulate through force. It does not suppress sensation or expression. It does not require monitoring. When sovereignty is present, control relaxes because it is no longer needed. Control holds the system together by compression. Sovereignty holds the system together by integration. Fourth, sovereignty versus withdrawal. Withdrawal is the removal of contact to preserve integrity. It is often mistaken for sovereignty because both involve not reacting. But withdrawal avoids contact because contact feels unsafe. Sovereignty remains in contact because contact is no longer threatening. Withdrawal is the absence. Sovereignty is presence. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Many people believe they are sovereign when they are actually disengaged. Their nervous system has learned that safety requires distance, so it shuts down responsiveness. This can feel calm, but it is brittle. When contact returns unexpectedly, the system destabilizes. Sovereignty does not destabilize under contract. That is its defining feature. With these distinctions clear, we can now stabilize a working definition, but not as a slogan, as a functional description that holds across biology, psychology, and language. Sovereignty is the nervous system's capacity to remain present in contact without organizing around threat. Every word in that definition matters. Capacity sovereignty is not a belief or an identity. It is an ability the system either has access to or does not, depending on conditions. Nervous system sovereignty is physiological before it is psychological. It is not achieved through mindset. It is reflected in tone, breath, posture, timing, and language. Remain present sovereignty is not withdrawal or detachment. Presence is maintained. In contact sovereignty is not isolation. It appears only in relation, interaction, and exposure, without organizing around threat. This is the core. A threat may exist, but it is not the organizing principle. Defense is not the default orientation. This definition already begins to expose why sovereignty cannot be achieved through assertion, independence, or control. All of those are ways of organizing around threat. Now we bring the mirror linguistic hypothesis fully into view. The mirror linguistic hypothesis proposes that language functions as a mirror of nervous system state before it functions as a carrier of meaning. This includes not only words, but pacing, prosody, silence, emphasis, repetition, and timing. Language broadcasts whether a system is defended or settled. From this perspective, sovereignty is not something language declares. It is something language stops signaling against. In defended states, language is saturated with threat management cues. These include over-explanation, preemptive justification, hedging, escalation, insistence, strategic silence, excessive clarification, or performative certainty. Each of these is a linguistic attempt to stabilize the field because the body does not feel stable. Language becomes an instrument of regulation. When sovereignty is present, that function dissolves. Language no longer works to protect alignment. It reflects alignment. Words arrive later. They carry less urgency. Silence loses its charge. Tone stabilizes. Pace slows naturally. This is why the earlier outline described the mirror linguistic hypothesis's role as light, but that understatement no longer applies here. Sovereignty is where the mirror linguistic hypothesis becomes explicit, because sovereignty is the first point in the arc where language is no longer compensatory at all. In stillness, language was absent. In sensation, language was secondary. In orientation, the language is named context. In discernment, language separated signal. In boundary, language marked edge. In voice, language carried expression. In agency, language confirmed choice. In reciprocity, language shaped timing. In coherence, language matched action. In sovereignty, language stops working in its defensive role, because nothing is said, but because nothing needs to be said to make the nervous system safe. This is why sovereignty feels strangely quiet. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory perspective, this quiet is not emptiness. It is field stability. When a nervous system no longer broadcasts defensive cues, the surrounding field reorganizes. Other systems may entrain to that stability, or they may destabilize in its presence. Either way, the sovereign system does not adjust itself to manage that response. This is critical. Before sovereignty, even coherence could be destabilized by others' reactions. Coherence was held internally, but still required some monitoring of the field. Sovereignty removes that requirement. The system trusts its own stability enough not to track others continuously. This trust is not cognitive. It is learned through repeated non-collapse. From a biological perspective, sovereignty reflects a nervous system with low baseline threat prediction in social contact. The amygdala does not flag interaction as inherently dangerous. The prefrontal cortex does not need to simulate outcomes excessively. The vagal system remains engaged without appeasement or shutdown. This allows presence without defense. Now we must address why modern culture equates sovereignty with dominance. Dominance is visible. Defense is loud. Control signals strength. In competitive coercive environments, those who broadcast threats often appear sovereign because they are not visibly affected. But what is often missed is that dominance is a reaction. It arises from a threat and perpetuates it. Dominant behavior organizes the field around fear. Sovereignty dissolves fear by not participating in it. This is why sovereignty is often invisible. It does not posture. It does not escalate. It does not announce boundaries loudly. It does not need to win. It simply remains. This remaining is often misinterpreted as weakness, passivity, or disengagement by systems that expect defense. But it is none of these. It is an internal authority that does not need to prove itself. This returns us to the original etymological sense of sovereignty, authority that is not being contested. Internally, sovereignty means there is no internal contest. No part of the system is fighting another part. No signal is being suppressed by force. No action is taken against the body's timing. Externally, sovereignty means the system does not treat contact as a contest. This is why sovereignty can only emerge after coherence. Before coherence, presence is fragile. It must be protected. Boundaries must be asserted. Language must be managed. Defense is necessary. After coherence, presence stabilizes. Defense relaxes. Sovereignty appears not as an achievement, but as a byproduct of stability. This is also why sovereignty cannot be rushed. Attempts to be sovereign often collapse into control or withdrawal. They are premature claims of a state that the nervous system cannot yet support. Volume 3 has been deliberately structured to prevent that collapse. Sovereignty appears only at the end because it requires every previous capacity to be online. Without sensation, presence is numb. Without orientation, presence is disorganized. Without a boundary, presence is porous. Without voice, presence is mute. Without agency, presence is reactive. Without reciprocity, presence is isolating. Without coherence, presence fragments. With all of those in place, sovereignty emerges naturally. And when it does, it feels exactly like this. Nothing needs to be defended. Nothing needs to be asserted. Nothing needs to be managed. Just presence intact in contact. That is sovereignty, stripped of myth and returned to function. In the next section, we will examine why defense became identity, why vigilance, armoring, and justification feel like maturity, and how sovereignty quietly dismantles that structure without confrontation. For now, let this definition settle not as an idea, but as a felt orientation. Sovereignty is not power over others. It is not power over yourself. It is the absence of power being required at all. Cognitive hook why and how defensiveness became an identity. Defense rarely announces itself as defense. It presents as a responsibility, as intelligence, as maturity, as a strength. It feels earned, it feels necessary, and over time it stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like who you are. This section exists to name that shift clearly, how protection turned into identity, how vigilance became mistaken for awareness, and how armoring was reframed as virtue, not because people chose it, but because their nervous systems adapted to environments that rewarded unresolved threat. To understand this, we have to begin beneath belief, beneath personality, beneath story, at the level of neuroception. Neuroception is the nervous system's unconscious process of detecting safety, danger, or life threat. It operates before conscious thought. It scans facial expression, tone, posture, pacing, proximity, and unpredictability. It does not ask whether something is actually dangerous. It asks whether it feels dangerous based on prior experience. When neuroception repeatedly detects threat in ordinary contact, criticism, unpredictability, emotional volatility, withdrawal, coercion, or shame, the nervous system adapts, not temporarily, but structurally. This is where defense begins its transformation. Initially, defense is episodic, a response to specific situations. The sympathetic system mobilizes. Muscles tense, attention narrows, language sharpens or floods. After the moment passes, the system settles. But when the threat is chronic or relational, when it comes from caregivers, authority figures, peers, or institutions, settling never fully happens. The nervous system learns that vigilance is required by default. This is the first cognitive shift. Vigilance becomes baseline. At this stage, vigilance still feels like an effort. You know you are on edge. You feel tired. You notice tension. But you tell yourself this is normal, necessary. This is just how things are. Over time, through neuroplasticity, that vigilance is no longer effortful. The nervous system reorganizes around it. Synaptic pathways strengthen. Threat prediction becomes faster. Muscular tension becomes habitual. Cognitive monitoring becomes automatic. This is not a psychological choice. It is biological learning. The brain becomes more efficient at detecting threats because it has been rewarded for doing so. The amygdala fires more readily. The prefrontal cortex remains engaged in monitoring and simulation. The vagal system spends less time in open social engagement and more time toggling between mobilization and controlled regulation. The result is a system that feels alert, capable, and on top of things. This is where vigilance becomes mistaken for awareness. Awareness is receptive. It allows information to arrive without distortion. Vigilance is selective. It filters information through threat bias. But because vigilance detects things others miss, tension shifts, risk, it feels intelligent. It feels perceptive. It feels responsible. People praise vigilance. They call it being switched on, emotionally intelligent, street smart, and prepared. No one calls it an unresolved threat. So vigilance consolidates. From here, the next shift occurs. Boundaries become held through tension rather than stability. Healthy boundaries do not require constant enforcement. They arise naturally from coherence. You know where you end. You know when something does not fit. You respond proportionately. But when vigilance is baseline, boundaries cannot relax. They must be maintained actively. The body holds edge through muscular tension, tone modulation, strategic distance, and anticipatory language. This is why many people experience boundaries as exhausting. They feel like work. They require constant attention. They must be asserted repeatedly. In these systems, a boundary dropping does not feel safe. It feels like a collapse, so the body learns to keep the boundary tight. Tight boundaries look strong. They feel controlled. They signal competence, but they are not stable. They are defended. Defended boundaries require continuous energy because they are compensating for internal instability. The nervous system does not trust itself to remain intact without tension, so it holds the line forcefully. Over time, this tension is no longer felt as tension. It becomes posture, tone, character. This is where defense begins to feel like identity. Psychologically, this is reinforced through narrative. People begin to describe themselves using the language of defense, but framed as virtue. I'm just very independent. I'm strong. I don't need anyone. I don't get affected by things. I've learned to rely on myself. I have high standards. I know how to protect my energy. Each of these statements may contain truth, but they often describe a nervous system that learns safety through separation, vigilance, and self-containment. The problem is not the strategy. The problem is when the strategy becomes who you are. At this point, defense is no longer a response. It is an identity structure. From a neurobiological perspective, identity here is not abstract. It is encoded in repeated patterns of neural firing, muscular tone, hormonal response, and attentional bias. The body expects a threat. The mind organizes around preparedness. The self-concept crystallizes around being the one who copes. This is where protection begins to feel virtuous. Why? Because it worked. It prevented harm. It avoided collapse. It earned approval. It kept things under control, and in many cases it was necessary. But what was once necessary becomes limiting when conditions change. Neuroplasticity cuts both ways. The same mechanisms that allowed adaptation also make it hard to let go. The nervous system does not update simply because the environment is safer. It updates only through repeated experiences of safety without defense. Until those experiences occur, defense remains justified internally, even when it is no longer externally required. This is why people often feel anxious when they try to relax. Relaxation feels unsafe. Stillness feels exposed. Openness feels risky, because defense has become synonymous with safety. This is also why justification becomes central. When defense becomes identity, justification becomes moralist. You do not just protect yourself, you explain why you must. You justify boundaries. You justify withdrawal. You justify control. You justify distance. Justification serves two functions. First, it stabilizes the self-image. It reassures you that your defense is reasonable, ethical, and necessary. Second, it manages the field. It preempts challenge. It communicates that your protection is not rejection, not hostility, not weakness. But justification itself is a signal of threat. From a mere linguistic hypothesis perspective, justification is defensive language. It arises when action does not feel fully supported internally. Language steps in to secure legitimacy because the body does not feel settled. This is why justification often escalates under questioning. When someone asks why the nervous system hears threat, language expands, tone tightens, identity enters. The defense is now fully online. This is also where vigilance becomes moral. People begin to equate being alert with being good. Being prepared means being responsible, being unaffected by being mature. Emotional neutrality with strength. This moralization is reinforced socially. Institutions reward reliability, not alignment. Productivity systems reward output, not coherence. Emotional restraint is praised more than emotional accuracy. Speed is valued over timing, so defense is not only adaptive, it is rewarded. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Neuroception detects threat, and vigilance increases, which leads to defense. In turn, this prevents harm. Defense is praised, and thus identity forms around defense and vigilance feels virtuous, which leads defense to become a state of permanence. At no point in this loop is anyone choosing to be defended. They are choosing survival, stability, and belonging. But the cost is fragmentation, because the defense does not integrate the signal, it suppresses it. From an embodied cognition perspective, this suppression has consequences. When sensation is overridden repeatedly, interoceptive accuracy declines. The body's signals become harder to interpret. Hunger, fatigue, discomfort, and emotional shifts blur. Decision-making relies more heavily on cognition because bodily guidance is unreliable. This increases cognitive load. The prefrontal cortex remains engaged in simulation, prediction, and control. Executive function stays online even at rest. This produces the background exhaustion many people live with. Yet because defense has become identity, this exhaustion is normalized. I'm just tired, that's life. This is adulthood. The idea that defense itself might be the source of fatigue rarely appears because defense is framed as necessary and virtuous. This brings us to the key reframe of this section, which must be held carefully because it can initially sound accusatory when it is not. Defense is not strength. It is an unresolved threat. This does not mean defense is weakness. It means defense indicates that the threat has not been fully metabolized by the nervous system. Strength in this framework is not the capacity to withstand more. It is the capacity to remain present without mobilization. Strength is stability without tension. Defense requires effort. Strength does not. This is why sovereign presence feels quieter than defended strength. It lacks the visible markers people associate with resilience. It does not posture, it does not assert, it does not explain itself, and because it does not perform strength, it is often misread. People accustomed to defended identities may feel unsettled around someone who is sovereign. There is no clear signal to respond to, no escalation, no appeasement, no justification. This can provoke projection. The sovereign person may be seen as cold, detached, arrogant, or indifferent, but these interpretations arise from others' nervous systems, searching for familiar defensive cues. Sovereignty removes those cues. This is why sovereignty can feel socially risky at first, not because it creates conflict, but because it removes a shared language of defense. From a mirror-linguistic hypothesis field theory perspective, this is a major field shift. Defended systems entrain to one another through shared vigilance. Tone matches tone, pace matches pace. Urgency propagates. When one system stops broadcasting defense, the field loses synchrony. Some systems relax in response. Others escalate. Sovereignty does not correct either response. It remains. This remaining is only possible because coherence has already stabilized the internal system. Without coherence, the absence of defense would feel like collapse. That is why sovereignty cannot be accessed directly. Attempts to drop defense without prior integration often lead to shutdown, overwhelm, or rearmoring. The arc matters. Volume 3 rebuilt the nervous system's capacity step by step, so that by the time defense relaxes, presence can hold. This section, then, is not an invitation to dismantle defense prematurely. It is an explanation of why defense became who you are, so that when it begins to soften naturally, you do not mistake that softening for weakness or loss. You are not losing strength when defense dissolves. You are resolving the threat, and when the threat resolves, identity reorganizes. Not into something louder, not into something harder, but into something quieter, steadier, and far more difficult to destabilize. In the next section, we will map sovereignty somatically, how presence feels when armor dissolves, and show how the nervous system behaves when defense is no longer required. For now, let this land. If defense feels like virtue, it is because threat has been normalized. If protection feels like identity, it is because safety was conditional. And if sovereignty feels unfamiliar, it is because it was never rewarded, only endured. Sovereignty is not learned through effort. It emerges when the threat no longer needs to be carried. That is not a moral achievement. It is a biological resolution. The somatic blueprint, how presence feels without armor sovereignty, is not a thought you arrive at. It is not a belief you adopt. It is not a value you commit to. Sovereignty is a felt organization of the body when threat no longer structures participation. To understand it, you have to move away from concepts entirely and into physiology, into how breath, posture, timing, sensation, and response behave when armor is no longer required. This section maps sovereignty as a bodily condition, not a psychological stance. The most immediate marker of sovereignty is breath, not deep breathing, not controlled breathing, not breath used as a regulatory technique. Sovereign breath is ordinary, unmanaged. It stays open without being held or shaped. And crucially, it remains open to the gaze. Gaze is one of the most potent social stimuli the nervous system responds to. Being looked at, especially attentively, critically, or unpredictably, activates threat detection rapidly. For defended systems, gaze triggers breath modulation almost instantly. The inhale shortens, the exhale is constrained. Sometimes the breath pauses entirely as the system prepares to respond. This breath holding is subtle, often unconscious, but it is one of the clearest signs that the body is preparing for impact. When sovereignty is present, breath does not reorganize under gaze. You can be seen without tightening. You can be listened to without holding air in the chest. You can remain in another's attention without compressing yourself. This does not mean breath becomes exaggerated or slow. It simply continues. That continuation matters more than depth. From a neurobiological perspective, this reflects low-threat neuroception. The vagus nerve remains engaged in its social branch rather than toggling into sympathetic mobilization or dorsal withdrawal. The nervous system does not interpret gaze as a precursor to harm. This is not learned cognitively. It is learned through repeated, non-threatening exposure, moments of being seen without consequence. When the nervous system no longer predicts harm from gaze, breath no longer needs to be prepared. This is sovereignty in the lungs. The second marker is posture. Defended posture is rarely obvious. It does not always look rigid or closed. Often it looks upright, attentive, ready. Shoulders slightly elevated, chest held, neck subtly forward, spine engaged beyond necessity. This posture signals competence and readiness. It is socially rewarded, but it is also armor. Armor in posture functions by maintaining muscular tension to prevent collapse, intrusion, or unpredictability. It keeps the body prepared to act or react. When sovereignty is present, posture becomes neutral. Neutral does not mean collapsed. It does not mean slouched. It means the body is supported by gravity rather than by muscular effort. The skeleton bears weight. Muscles do not hold shape unnecessarily. Neutral posture is dynamic. It adjusts naturally. It does not lock into positions to maintain appearance or readiness. Under challenge, this neutrality holds. Someone disagrees with you, the body does not stiffen. Someone questions you, the spine does not brace. Someone expresses intensity, the shoulders do not rise. This does not mean there is no response. It means the response is proportionate. Proportionate response is the hallmark of sovereignty. The body reacts only to what is actually happening, not to what might happen. From an embodied cognition perspective, posture reflects internal prediction. A body that expects threat holds itself differently than a body that expects continuity. Sovereignty is the body predicting continuity rather than rupture. The third marker is timing. Timing is often discussed cognitively: when to speak, when to act, when to decide. But timing is first a bodily phenomenon. It is sensed before it is thought. The defensive nervous systems collapse timing. They move early. They respond quickly. They fill gaps. They rush decisions. This urgency is not impatience. It is a threat response. The body believes that delay increases danger. When sovereignty is present, timing holds. Holding timing does not mean hesitation. It means the body tolerates the space between stimulus and response without mobilizing. There is no internal pressure to resolve immediately. This is one of the most profound shifts sovereignty brings. You can be challenged and not respond right away. You can feel provoked and let it pass without reaction. You can sit inside ambiguity without needing closure. This timing stability reflects changes at multiple neural levels. The amygdala's threat signaling is quieter. The prefrontal cortex does not oversimulate outcomes. The insula accurately tracks interoceptive signals without escalating them. The vagal system maintains engagement without appeasement. In practical terms, this means you can pause without disappearing. Disappearing dissociation is a collapse of timing into absence. Appeasement and fawning are a collapse of timing into premature response. Sovereignty is neither. It is presence that waits. Waiting here is not a restraint. It is the absence of pressure. The body does not feel like something bad will happen if it does not act immediately. That belief has dissolved. This brings us to sympathetic recruitment. In defended interaction, sympathetic activation is constant, not extreme, but persistent. Heart rate slightly elevated, muscles primed, attention narrowed, energy mobilized. This baseline mobilization is exhausting, but because it is familiar, it feels normal. When sovereignty is present, sympathetic activation becomes situational rather than baseline. The system mobilizes when mobilization is required. It relaxes when it is not. This flexibility is key. Sovereignty is not low arousal at all times. It is appropriate and proportional arousal. You can assert when needed without escalating. You can respond forcefully without losing integrity. You can engage intensity without being overtaken by it. This is why sovereignty should not be confused with calmness. Calmness can be dissociative. Sovereignty is responsive. From a neurobiological standpoint, sovereignty reflects efficient nervous system functioning. Energy is not wasted on unnecessary defense. The system is metabolically economical. This economy shows up as reduced fatigue. Interactions cost less. Recovery is quicker. There is less need to decompress after contact because the system was not overactivated in the first place. Another crucial marker is facial musculature. Defensive nervous systems often hold micro-expressions, slight tension around the eyes, jaw engagement, controlled expressions. To manage how one is perceived, these expressions are rarely conscious. They are learned through social conditioning. They signal readiness, politeness, neutrality, or authority. When sovereignty is present, the face rests, not blank, not expressionless. responsive but not held. Expressions arise and pass without being managed. There is no effort to appear a certain way. The face reflects internal state rather than controlling it. This has significant mirror linguistic hypothesis implications. Facial musculature is one of the strongest carriers of mirror signals. Other nervous systems read it immediately. When the face is defended, it broadcasts vigilance. When the face rests, it broadcasts safety. This is not intentional signaling. It is state transparency. Sovereignty allows transparency without risk. Another somatic marker is voice, not content, voice quality. Defensive voice often carries subtle tension, tightness in the throat, controlled volume, modulated pitch, words shaped to avoid reaction. Sovereign voice is unguarded. It is not loud or soft by design. It matches the internal state. It does not rush. It does not withhold. It does not fill space unnecessarily. There is often more silence between phrases, not dramatic silence, just natural pauses. These pauses are not strategic. They are the body taking the time it needs. Again, this is not something you do. It is something that happens when the body no longer feels threatened by contact. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, this is critical. Language is no longer being used to regulate the field. The field is already regulated by the state. Language becomes secondary. Words carry meaning rather than defense. This is why sovereignty often feels like relief at the level of the throat. Many people report a sense of space there when armor dissolves. The throat is no longer guarding expression. It is simply available. This availability does not mean you speak more. Often you speak less, because speech is no longer required to stabilize you. Another marker is sensory openness. Defensive nervous systems narrow perception. They focus on what matters for safety. They miss nuance. They miss subtle pleasure. They miss peripheral information. When sovereignty is present, perception widens. You notice sound, light, texture, and temperature without being overwhelmed. Sensation becomes richer because it is no longer filtered through threat. This sensory richness is often misinterpreted as vulnerability, but it is actually robustness. A system that can feel more without destabilizing is more resilient, not less. This is embodied cognition in action. The body's capacity to process information without threat determines how much of the world it can take in. Sovereignty increases bandwidth. This increased bandwidth allows for nuance in interaction. You can hold complexity without simplifying. You can tolerate mixed signals without forcing resolution. You can remain present in ambiguity. This is why sovereignty supports wisdom rather than certainty. Certainty collapses complexity to reduce discomfort. Sovereignty tolerates complexity because discomfort does not equal danger. This brings us back to the key line of this section, which must be felt, not memorized. Sovereignty is the body not preparing for impact. Impact implies collision. It implies force. It implies something that must be absorbed or deflected. When the body stops preparing for impact, contact ceases to be experienced as a collision. It becomes an encounter. Encounter does not require armor. This does not mean harm never occurs. It means harm is responded to when it occurs, not anticipated endlessly. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is a resolution. Trauma trains the nervous system to prepare for impact, even when none is present. Sovereignty retains the system to distinguish between actual threat and remembered threat. This retraining is not achieved through reassurance. It is achieved through the lived experience of non-collapse. Each time you remain present under gaze without bracing, the nervous system updates. Each time you are challenged and survive without armoring, the system learns. Each time you do not justify and nothing breaks, threat prediction recalibrates. This is neuroplasticity at work. New patterns replace old ones not because you force them, but because they cost less energy. Sovereignty is energy efficient. This efficiency is often what people feel first. They describe feeling less tired, less irritable, less on edge. They may not have language for sovereignty, but they feel its effects. As this episode continues, we will move from physiology to lived interaction, to language, to observation. But this section must stand as the somatic foundation. If sovereignty does not feel like this in the body, open breath, neutral posture, stable timing, low vigilance, responsive presence, then what is being called sovereignty is something else. Perhaps control, perhaps withdrawal, perhaps dissociation, perhaps dominance. True sovereignty is quiet. It is felt more than seen. It does not need to be defended because the body no longer expects attack, and when the body no longer expects attack, presence becomes its natural state. That is the blueprint, not a mindset, not a posture, not an identity, a body at rest in contact. From here, we will look at sovereignty in the field of how it shows up in interaction without performance or protection, and how language functions when defense is no longer required. Sovereignty is not something to practice. It is something the nervous system remembers when the threat finally loosens its grip. Field case study, remaining present without being defensive. This case study does not revolve around resolution. There is no dramatic confrontation, no breakthrough conversation, no decisive boundary moment. What makes it significant is precisely its ordinariness. Sovereignty rarely announces itself in moments of crisis. It reveals itself in everyday contact, in situations that once required vigilance, explanation, or self-protection, and now do not. The field here is relational, a familiar environment, a recurring set of interactions. People who know you well enough to have expectations, interpretations, and assumptions about who you are and how you will respond. This familiarity is important because sovereignty is easiest to fake with strangers. It is hardest to embody where history exists. Before sovereignty, this field required management. Not overtly. No one demanded compliance. No one was hostile, but the interactions carried subtle pressure. Questions often came with implications. Misunderstandings tended to linger. Being seen felt evaluative rather than neutral. In this field, presence used to require defense. Defense did not look aggressive. It looked articulate, thoughtful, responsive. It looked like explaining yourself clearly, clarifying intentions, anticipating misinterpretation, softening tone, framing decisions carefully so they would not be read as rejection, incompetence, or indifference. This defense was relationally successful. It kept things smooth. It prevented conflict. It maintained a connection. But it came at a cost. After interactions, there was residue. A subtle fatigue, a need to replay what was said, a sense of having been on, a feeling that something had been held together rather than simply allowed to be. That residue was the cost of defense. As coherence stabilized, something began to change. Not deliberately, not through effort. The body simply stopped offering the old strategies as readily. The impulse to justify weakened. The reflex to clarify softened. The need to manage perception faded. This is where sovereignty begins to be tested, not as a concept, but as a capacity, being questioned without justification. The first scenario is deceptively simple. A question is asked, not an attack, not an accusation, just a question that historically carried weight. A question that once implied doubt, expectation, or evaluation. Before sovereignty, this question would trigger an internal sequence. A quick scan. What does this mean? A preparation. How should I respond? A framing. How do I answer so this lands well? A justification. Why this makes sense. The response would be clear, measured, and thorough. It would cover bases. It would anticipate follow-up. It would demonstrate competence and reasonableness. This time, something different happens. The question arises. The body registers it. There is a pause. Not a strategic pause. Not a withholding pause. Just the time it takes for the signal to form, and then a response comes, short, accurate, and sufficient. No backstory. No preemptive reassurance. No explanation beyond what is actually needed. The response does not attempt to manage how the questioner feels about the answer. It simply answers. This is not defiance. It is not indifference. It is the absence of threat. What is striking in this moment is not what is said, but what does not happen. There is no internal tension spike, no urge to elaborate, no after-the-fact replay. The body remains settled. The field responds variably. Sometimes the questioner accepts the answer and moves on. Sometimes they ask another question. Sometimes they seem momentarily unsettled by the brevity. But none of these responses requires correction. This is a key reframe of sovereignty. You do not manage the field's reaction to your presence. Managing reaction is a defensive act. It assumes that reaction is dangerous. Sovereignty does not make that assumption. Boundaries here are implicit. They are not announced. They are held through stability, rather than explanation. The absence of justification is not a power move. It is a physiological signal that the nervous system does not perceive a threat. Being misunderstood without escalation, the second scenario is more challenging. A misunderstanding occurs. Something you say or do is interpreted differently from what was intended. Not maliciously, not dramatically, but enough that the gap is noticeable. Before sovereignty, this gap would have been intolerable. Misunderstanding felt dangerous because it threatened identity and connection. It risked being seen incorrectly. It risked consequences, so the body would mobilize to close the gap immediately. Clarify, explain, correct, repair. This repair impulse was fast and strong. It felt responsible, caring, necessary. Now the misunderstanding is noticed and left alone. Not because it does not matter, but because it does not feel urgent. The body registers the misalignment. There is a flicker of sensation, maybe a brief tightening, a moment of awareness. And then it settles. No rush to fix. No need to correct immediately. No escalation. This is one of the clearest lived expressions of sovereignty. The system no longer equates misunderstanding with threat. This does not mean misunderstandings are never addressed. They are, but they are addressed when timing supports it, not when anxiety demands it. Sometimes the misunderstanding resolves on its own as more context emerges. Sometimes it remains. Sometimes it becomes relevant later. The crucial difference is that the nervous system does not reorganize itself around the gap. This capacity changes everything. Disagreement and misalignment no longer threaten coherence. They become information rather than danger. From a field perspective, this alters relational dynamics profoundly. People accustomed to immediate repair may feel unsettled by the lack of correction. They may push for clarification. They may interpret the pause as withdrawal or resistance. Sovereignty does not correct that interpretation. It allows the other nervous system to reveal its own relationship to ambiguity. This is not passive. It is discerning. By not escalating, sovereignty exposes where escalation originates. Often, it is not the misunderstanding itself, but the other person's intolerance of uncertainty. Before sovereignty, you may have carried that intolerance for them. You would rush to resolve their discomfort. Now you do not. This is presence without explanation, being seen without performance. The third scenario is the most subtle and the most revealing. You are seen, not misunderstood, not questioned, just seen, attended to, noticed, perhaps even appreciated. Before sovereignty, being seen required performance. You adjusted your posture, you managed to tone, you curated expression, you shaped yourself into something legible and acceptable. Even positive attention activated vigilance because it implied expectation. Praise could be as destabilizing as criticism because it raised the stakes. Now, being seen does not recruit strategy. You do not lean into attention or pull away from it. You do not amplify yourself to meet it or diminish yourself to escape it. You remain. This is extraordinarily difficult for nervous systems that learn safety through adaptation. Being seen without performance feels exposed at first. There is nothing to hide behind, no role to play. But exposure here is not vulnerability in the usual sense. It is simply the absence of self-management. The body does not tighten under attention. Breath stays open. Posture remains neutral. The face remains responsive, but unguarded. This does not mean you are emotionally open in a demonstrative way. It means you are not armored. The field responds in unpredictable ways. Some people relax in your presence. They feel less pressure to perform. Others become uneasy. They search for cues that are no longer there. They may try to provoke a reaction or elicit reassurance. Sovereignty does not oblige either response. It stays present without adjusting to manage the experience of being seen. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of sovereignty. You allow yourself to exist without narrating or shaping that existence for others. From a neurolinguistic hypothesis field perspective, this shifts the entire communicative substrate. Language becomes minimal not by design, but because the state no longer needs translation. Words are no longer used to stabilize identity. Identity is not at stake. Reframes in action across these scenarios. 3 reframes become embodied rather than conceptual. Boundaries without tension. Boundaries here are not statements. They are not explanations. They are not enforced. They are felt. You know when something does not fit. You respond accordingly. There is no tightness, no edge holding, no bracing. Tension is what boundaries use when stability is absent. Sovereignty replaces tension with groundedness. Disagreement without identity threat. Disagreement does not destabilize the self. There is no need to defend being right, good, or reasonable. Difference does not imply danger. This allows disagreement to remain local. It does not spread through the system. Presence without explanation. Presence no longer needs justification. You do not explain why you are quiet. You do not explain why you chose something. You do not explain why you did not respond immediately. Explanation becomes optional, contextual, informational, not defensive. The cost that disappears. Perhaps the most noticeable change in this case study is what happens afterwards. There is no residue, no replay, no post-interaction analysis, no lingering tension. The nervous system returns to baseline naturally because it never left it dramatically in the first place. This absence of cost is often what people notice before they recognize sovereignty itself. They say, I feel less tired after conversations, or I don't need as much time alone afterwards, or things don't get to me the way they used to. These are not signs of detachment. They are signs of reduced defensive activation. The system is no longer spending energy protecting itself from contact. What sovereignty is not. It is important to name what sovereignty is not, because this case study could easily be misread. This is not emotional withdrawal. You are still responsive. This is not indifference. You still care. This is not dominance. You are not controlling the interaction. This is not passivity. You respond when a response is called for. This is not suppression. Sensation remains online. What has disappeared is the need to manage safety through behavior. Safety is internalized. The field learns to one final observation emerges over time. As sovereignty stabilizes in one system, the field begins to adapt. Some relationships deepen. They become simpler, less performative, more honest. Some relationships strain. They relied on your management to function. Without it, the imbalance becomes visible. Sovereignty does not save all relationships. It reveals which ones were held together by defense. This revelation can be painful, but it is clarifying. You stop carrying dynamics that were never reciprocal. You stop stabilizing fields that require self-erasure. You stop confusing effort with connection. This is not a loss. It is accuracy. Closing the case. This field case study does not end with a resolution because sovereignty is not an outcome. It is an ongoing condition. Each interaction offers an opportunity to remain present without defense. Sometimes you will succeed. Sometimes old patterns will return. That is not failure. It is information. Sovereignty is not brittle. It tolerates fluctuation. What matters is that defense is no longer compulsory. You can justify if you choose. You can explain if it is useful. You can assert if necessary, but you do not have to. That freedom is sovereignty, and it shows itself not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments where you remain present, intact, and unguarded, and nothing breaks. Language and sovereignty, when words don't protect language, is where sovereignty becomes unmistakable. Not because sovereignty speaks louder, clearer, or more convincingly, but because language stops doing a job it was never meant to do. For most people, language functions as armor. It protects, it anticipates, it negotiates safety, it repairs misalignment, it justifies presence. None of this is pathological, it is adaptive. Language becomes a regulatory instrument when the nervous system does not trust contact. Words are recruited to manage threat before threat arrives. Tone is shaped to avoid reaction. Explanation is layered to preempt misunderstanding. Silence is filled to prevent ambiguity. Or silence is used deliberately to maintain control. All of that is language under defense. Sovereignty does not improve language. It removes defense, and language is restored to its original function, reflection of state, rather than protection from outcome. This section traces that shift in depth. Language as threat management before sovereignty. Language is rarely about meaning alone. It is about timing, implication, perception, and consequence. People speak not only to say something, but to prevent something else from happening. Prevent conflict, prevent misinterpretation, prevent disappointment, prevent rejection, and prevent loss of control. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, this is language being used as a preemptive regulatory signal. The nervous system does not feel safe letting the field unfold naturally, so language steps in early to shape it. This preemption shows up in multiple forms: over-explaining, where additional words are added to stabilize legitimacy; hedging, where certainty is softened to avoid challenge; clarifying prematurely, where questions are answered before they are asked; framing excessively, where context is built to guide interpretation; performative confidence, where tone is used to suppress doubt. Each of these patterns has the same root: the body is preparing for impact. Language becomes an extension of the fight or flight system. Not loud or aggressive, but strategic. From the outside, this often looks like intelligence, eloquence, or emotional awareness. From the inside, it feels like effort. Sovereignty begins where that effort is no longer required. Speech no longer preemptive. One of the earliest linguistic changes in sovereignty is timing. Speech slows, not because the person chooses to speak slowly, but because speech is no longer rushing ahead of the moment to secure safety. Before sovereignty, words often arrive early. They jump in to fill space. They answer before silence becomes uncomfortable. They shape interpretation before ambiguity has time to breathe. After sovereignty, words wait, not withholding, not calculating, just waiting for the signal to complete. This waiting is somatic. The body no longer feels urgency to speak. There is no internal alarm telling you that silence is dangerous. When words arrive, they arrive whole. They do not trail off into explanation. They do not require scaffolding. They feel complete. This completeness is not rhetorical. It is physiological. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis standpoint, preemptive speech broadcasts a threat. It tells the field that something must be managed right now. Sovereign speech broadcasts stability. It says nothing explicitly, but the nervous system of the listener receives the signal. This system is not defending itself. That signal changes the field more than content ever could. Silence no longer strategic. Silence is one of the most misunderstood aspects of sovereignty. In defensive nervous systems, silence is rarely neutral. It is loaded. It is used to withhold, punish, provoke, control, or protect. Even silence that looks calm often carries tension. Strategic silence still orients around threat. It says, I will not speak because speaking would cost me safety. Sovereign silence says nothing at all. It is not chosen. It is not deployed. It is simply what happens when there is nothing to say, and no need to manage that fact. This silence feels different in the body. There is no tightness in the throat, no held breath, no monitoring of reaction. The body remains open, the face remains responsive. Attention stays present. This is why sovereign silence can feel unsettling to others. There is no cue to interpret, no defensive signal to read, no escalation or appeasement. People accustomed to defensive language may feel exposed by this neutrality. They may project meaning onto it. They may try to provoke a response. Sovereignty does not correct those projections. Language is no longer used to stabilize others' nervous systems. This is a crucial shift. Before sovereignty, many people unconsciously use language to regulate the field, to calm others, reassure them, guide them, and manage their reactions. This is often framed as empathy or care, but it is also labor. Sovereignty removes that labor, not out of indifference, but because regulation is no longer outsourced to language. Language reflecting state rather than guarding it at the deepest level, sovereignty restores transparency between state and language. Before sovereignty, language often contradicts the state. You feel uncertain but sound confident. You feel tired but sound engaged. You feel misaligned but explain convincingly. You feel pressured but reassure calmly. This contradiction requires energy. The nervous system must suppress one signal while amplifying another. Over time, this split becomes exhausting and disorienting. Sovereignty resolves the split. Language aligns with the state not because you decide to be honest, but because there is no reason to hide the state anymore. This does not mean you narrate your internal experience. It means your language no longer masks it. If you are uncertain, your words reflect openness rather than certainty. If you are clear, your words arrive simply. If you do not know, silence or a brief acknowledgement is enough. There is no attempt to compensate. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, this alignment is the return of language to its mirroring function. Language mirrors internal organization. When the organization is stable, the mirror is clean. This is why sovereign language often sounds understated. It lacks embellishment. It lacks urgency. It lacks defense, and yet it often carries more weight. Because weight does not come from force. It comes from congruence. The end of justification. Justification is one of the clearest indicators of defended language. Justification explains why before anyone has asked. It fills space to prevent judgment. It signals that the speaker is aware of potential criticism and is preemptively addressing it. Justification arises when an action does not feel fully supported internally. Sovereignty removes the need for justification because action is already settled. This does not mean you never explain. It means explanation is informational, not defensive. You explain when context requires it. You clarify when clarity serves understanding. You do not explain to protect yourself from being seen wrongly. This distinction is subtle but profound. Defensive explanation feels heavy. Sovereign explanation feels light. One carries urgency, the other carries timing. Language without outcome management. Another deep shift is the end of outcome management. Before sovereignty, language is often oriented toward results. How will this land? What will they think? How do I make sure this doesn't escalate? Speech is shaped to produce a desired outcome. After sovereignty, language is no longer responsible for the outcome. You speak because something needs to be expressed, not because you are trying to control what happens next. This does not mean you are reckless with words. It means you trust the field to respond without you steering it constantly. This trust is not naive. It is earned through coherence. Coherence taught the nervous system that action aligned with the signal does not require repair. Sovereignty extends that trust into language. The mirror linguistic hypothesis at its deepest. Language as absence of defense at its deepest level. The mirror linguistic hypothesis does not describe what language does, but what language stops doing when the state is regulated. When the nervous system is settled, language stops broadcasting threat cues. No urgency in pace, no tension in tone, no excessive framing, no performative clarity. The absence of these cues is itself communicative. Other nervous systems feel it, not cognitively, somatically. This is why sovereign language often creates space around it. Conversation slow, escalation dissipates, silence becomes tolerable. Not because the sovereign speaker is managing the field, but because the field is no longer being driven by threat signals. This is field-level regulation without effort. Why sovereign language feels risky for people whose identity is formed around linguistic competence, articulateness, emotional intelligence, persuasion, explanation, and sovereign language can feel like a loss. You may feel less impressive, less sharp, less in control. This is because defense used to provide structure. When defense drops, language becomes simpler. That simplicity can feel like vulnerability, but it is not vulnerability. It is the absence of distortion. What remains is accuracy. Key insight, fully realized. This brings us to the central insight of this section, now grounded across physiology, cognition, and field dynamics. Sovereignty restores language by removing defense, not by adding skill, not by refining technique, not by learning how to speak better, but by resolving the threat that language was compensating for. When the body no longer prepares for impact, language no longer needs to protect. Words stop negotiating safety. Silence stops signaling danger. Speech stops arriving early. Language returns to its rightful place, not as armor, not as leverage, not as repair, but as expression. And when language functions that way, it does something remarkable. It becomes trustworthy, not because it is persuasive, but because it is aligned. That is sovereignty speaking. In the next section, we will shift away from language again and into observation, on how to notice sovereignty without turning it into another identity or performance. Observation practice, noticing when you don't brace this section, is deliberately deceptive in its simplicity. It does not ask you to do anything. It does not invite you to practice a skill, cultivate a posture, or maintain a state. It asks only that you notice what is already occurring when the nervous system is not organizing around threat. That request sounds modest. In reality, it cuts against nearly everything most nervous systems have learned to do in contact, because most awareness has been trained as monitoring, not noticing. Monitoring is effortful. It scans, predicts, evaluates, and corrects. It is vigilance refined into a habit. Noticing, as used here, is something else entirely. It is receptive. It does not prepare. It does not adjust. It does not intervene. This distinction matters because sovereignty collapses the moment noticing turns into monitoring. So before anything else, the frame must be set clearly. This is not an awareness practice designed to increase control. It is an orientation that allows the nervous system to recognize when control is unnecessary. The rule remains absolute and non-negotiable. No asserting, no withdrawing, just noticing presence. Asserting would be the body stepping forward to stabilize identity. Withdrawing would be the body stepping back to preserve safety. Both are forms of defense. Presence is neither. Noticing moments of contact without tension. Contact is the primary site of bracing. Not trauma, not a crisis. Contact. Another person is entering your perceptual field. Someone is waiting for you to respond. Someone watching. Someone disagrees lightly. Someone misunderstanding. These moments are small, frequent, and easily overlooked, which is precisely why they shape nervous system organization more than dramatic events ever could. In defensive nervous systems, contact automatically recruits microtension. This tension is not always strong enough to feel like anxiety. Often, it registers as readiness, engagement, alertness. The body subtly mobilizes, breath shortens, posture firms, attention narrows, language begins to form. This mobilization feels responsible. It feels like being present. And because it has been rewarded socially, it feels correct. What this observation invites you to notice is when that mobilization does not occur. There will be moments, brief, unremarkable, often gone as soon as you notice them, where contact happens, and the body remains neutral. Someone looks at you, and nothing tightens. Someone speaks, and your breath continues. Someone pauses, and you do not lean forward. These moments can feel almost invisible. There is no signal telling you, this is sovereignty. There is simply an absence of preparation. That absence is the data. When you notice contact without tension, do not mark it as success. Success invites repetition. Repetition invites effort. Effort invites defense. Instead, let the noticing be fleeting, almost accidental. This fleeting quality is essential. Sovereignty is not sustained by holding a state. It is recognized in moments where the state holds itself. If you try to stay relaxed, you are already bracing. So notice, then release the noticing. Noticing when explanation is unnecessary. Explanation is one of the most reliable indicators of defense because it appears precisely where the nervous system does not trust its own alignment. Before sovereignty, explanation often feels like care. You explain so others understand. You explain so things don't escalate. You explain so you are not misjudged. You explain so that your intentions are clear. But beneath those narratives is a simpler physiological truth. Explanation arises when the body predicts threat. Threat of being misunderstood. Threat of being judged. Threat of losing connection. Explanation attempts to resolve those threats linguistically before they materialize. This observation is not asking you to stop explaining. Stopping explanation would be another form of control. It would turn language into a restraint. Instead, you are asked to notice when an explanation does not arise. These moments can be subtle. You answer a question simply and feel complete. You make a decision and do not rehearse how to defend it. You respond minimally and do not feel the urge to add more. In these moments, explanation is unnecessary because alignment is intact. The body does not feel exposed by its action. What is critical here is not what you say, but what happens afterwards. In defensive and defended nervous system states, explanation continues internally even if it stops externally. The mind rehearses, refines, and anticipates follow-up. The nervous system remains active. In sovereign moments, there is no internal continuation. The system settles. Notice that settling. Do not amplify it. Do not try to hold on to it. Simply recognize that the explanation did not occur and nothing collapsed. This is how the nervous system learns that explanation is optional rather than compulsory. Noticing when silence feels neutral. Silence is often the most revealing diagnostic of defense. In defensive or defended nervous systems, silence is rarely empty. It is heavy with implication. It feels like something is being withheld, something is about to happen, or something must be managed. Silence can trigger urgency, say something. It can trigger anxiety, they're thinking something, and it can trigger control, hold the silence to assert something. All of these responses indicate that silence is being treated as a threat. Neutral silence feels completely different. Neutral silence does not pull attention. It does not demand action. It does not carry a meaning that needs decoding. It is simply the absence of sound. Notice when silence appears, and your body does nothing. Your breath continues, your posture remains unchanged. Your attention does not jump ahead. This kind of silence often appears in very small windows, a pause in conversation, a moment of waiting, a shared stillness. Again, do not try to create it. Creating silence intentionally is still a strategy. Strategy implies threat. Neutral silence appears spontaneously when the nervous system is not mobilized. If you notice silence and immediately think, oh, this feels calm, that thought itself may reintroduce monitoring. Let the silence pass without comment. Why noticing must remain non-interventional at this depth. It becomes essential to understand why doing nothing is the most powerful part of this practice. Nervous systems learn through prediction error. When the system predicts a threat and no threat occurs, it updates. When the system predicts collapse and remains intact, it recalibrates. But this learning only occurs when the system is allowed to experience the outcome without interference. If you intervene by relaxing deliberately, by correcting posture, by managing breath, by choosing silence, the nervous system does not learn that safety was already present. It learns that safety requires effort. That distinction determines whether sovereignty stabilizes or collapses back into technique. So the noticing must remain passive. Passive does not mean inattentive. It means non-directive. You are not telling the body what to do. You are allowing it to recognize what it is already doing when the threat is absent. The science layer, why this works at a neurobiological level. This observation practice reduces threat prediction in social proximity. The amygdala is not a fear center. It is a relevance detector. It flags stimuli that require mobilization. When it repeatedly predicts threat in contact, it biases the entire system toward defense. Each time contact occurs without mobilization and nothing adverse follows, the amygdala's threat model updates. This update does not require conscious insight. It requires experience. Similarly, the prefrontal cortex reduces its monitoring load. It no longer needs to simulate outcomes constantly. Cognitive resources are freed up. Attention becomes less effortful. The vagal system remains engaged in social connection without tipping into appeasement or withdrawal. Heart rate variability improves. Breath patterns stabilize. Muscular tone softens without collapse. This is nervous system efficiency without armor. Efficiency here means lower energetic cost for the same level of participation. You are not doing less. You are spending less energy doing it. Over time, this efficiency manifests as less post-interaction fatigue, reduced irritability, less rumination, greater tolerance for ambiguity. None of these should be pursued. They are byproducts. Why sovereignty cannot be claimed as this observation deepens, there may be a temptation to identify with it. I'm becoming more sovereign. I'm not bracing like I used to. I'm handling things better now. These thoughts are understandable. They are also dangerous. Claiming sovereignty turns it into identity. Identity invites defense. Defense reintroduces threat. Sovereignty must remain impersonal. It is not you being sovereign. It is the nervous system not preparing for impact. This impersonal framing protects the process from being co-opted by ego or performance. If you notice yourself thinking about sovereignty, return to noticing contact without tension. Let the concept fall away. Fluctuation is not failure, it is important to state explicitly. Bracing will return. There will be days when vigilance spikes. Situations where old patterns reassert themselves. People whose presence activates unresolved threats. This is not regression, it is information. Sovereignty does not mean permanent openness. It means choice becomes possible. Sometimes defense is appropriate. Sovereignty allows defense without identity. You can brace when needed and release when not. The difference is flexibility. Defensive or defended nervous systems are rigid. Sovereign systems are adaptive. So when bracing appears, do not correct it. Notice it. Bracing noticed without judgment often softens on its own. The final orientation, this observation practice does not aim to increase sovereignty. It aims to recognize when sovereignty is already present. That recognition teaches the nervous system that safety exists without effort. Over time, those recognitions accumulate, not as achievements, not as habits, but as embodied memory. Memory that contact does not always harm. Memory that silence is not dangerous, and memory that the explanation is optional. This memory reorganizes participation more deeply than any technique. So hold the rule gently and consistently, no asserting, no withdrawing, just noticing presence. If nothing seems to happen, that is fine. If noticing feels brief and unsatisfying, that is fine. If you forget to notice entirely, that is fine. Sovereignty does not require diligence. It requires space, and space appears naturally when the nervous system stops preparing for impact. That is the quiet work of this section. Nothing more is needed. Self-reflection prompt gentle internal contact. This question is not meant to be answered. It is meant to be felt. Where do I still need to prepare for impact? Do not look for examples. Do not scan your history. Do not analyze your patterns. Let the body respond first. Preparation for impact is rarely dramatic. It often appears as readiness, as professionalism, as being on, as staying ahead of the moment. It can live in the jaw before speaking, in the breath that tightens under attention, in the posture that firms when someone looks at you, in the mind that rehearses what might be said next. Notice where the question creates sensation. It might be a tightening, a slight forward pull, a subtle contraction, a familiar alertness. That sensation is the response. You are not being asked to change it. You are not being asked to relax it. Any attempt to do so would turn this into an effort, and effort is another form of preparation. Simply let the sensation be known. If the mind begins to explain why this makes sense, where it comes from, what should be done about it, let those thoughts pass. Explanation is itself a form of armor. You do not need it here. This question is not about insight. It is about recognition. Where preparation remains, the threat is still being predicted. That prediction once served you. It may still serve you in some contexts. There is no need to judge it. Recognition alone begins recalibration. Let the question linger lightly. It may return during the day, during conversation, during moments of attention or silence. If it does, do nothing with it. Let it pass through without action. This reflection is complete the moment it touches the body. No answer is required. Integration sovereignty is not separation. Sovereignty stabilizes where separation was once felt necessary. This is the integration that completes the arc of Volume 3. Not by adding a new skill or posture, but by dissolving a misunderstanding that quietly governed nearly every previous strategy. The belief that safety requires distance. Separation has worn many disguises across this series. Stillness was once mistaken for withdrawal. Boundary was once mistaken for rejection. Agency was once mistaken for control. Coherence was once mistaken for certainty. And sovereignty, more than any other term, is most often mistaken for independence. This section exists to anchor sovereignty cleanly by dismantling those confusions at the level where they form, not ideologically, but physiologically and relationally. Sovereignty is not the opposite of connection. It is what makes connection possible without self-erasure. We begin with the most common misreading: sovereignty versus dominance. Dominance looks stable because it suppresses instability. It forces order through hierarchy, volume, certainty, or speed. Dominance often appears calm because it disallows challenge. Others adapt around it. The dominant system rarely appears affected because the field absorbs the impact. This creates a powerful illusion. The dominant individual looks sovereign. They are not reacting. They are not justifying. They are not yielding. They seem grounded. But dominance is not stability. It is coercion. At the nervous system level, dominance is a mobilization strategy. It keeps sympathetic activation online and projects threat outward so that the internal threat does not need to be felt. Dominance externalizes danger. Sovereignty internalizes safety. This distinction matters because dominance requires constant reinforcement. It must be maintained through vigilance, assertion, and control. When challenged, dominance escalates or collapses. It does not hold quietly. Sovereignty does not escalate when challenged. It does not need to. Challenge does not threaten its integrity. From a mirror linguistic perspective, dominance is loud. It broadcasts certainty, urgency, and finality. It uses language to close the space. Sovereignty leaves space open without losing ground. Dominance says this is how it is. Sovereignty says nothing and remains intact. Dominance depends on others yielding. Sovereignty does not depend on others at all. So when sovereignty is mistaken for dominance, people attempt to assert it. They speak more forcefully. They set harder boundaries. They withdraw consent loudly. They confuse strength with volume. What results is not sovereignty. It is armoring, sovereignty versus independence. Independence is often praised as maturity, self-reliance, standing on your own, not needing anyone. It is framed as freedom from entanglement. But independence is frequently a trauma solution. It emerges when reliance has proven unsafe, when a connection comes with a cost, when dependency has been punished or exploited. Independence removes the threat by removing the bond. This can feel empowering, especially after periods of enmeshment or coercion, but it remains organized around threat. The independent nervous system stays alert to intrusion. It maintains distance. It relies on control and self-sufficiency to remain safe. It may function well, but it is not relaxed. Sovereignty does not require distance. A sovereign system can rely, connect, and be affected without losing integrity. It does not need to stand alone because the connection does not destabilize it. Independence is protected by isolation. Sovereignty stabilizes by coherence. From an embodied cognition perspective, independence often correlates with subtle tension. The body remains ready to handle everything alone. There is little allowance for rest, receptivity, or support. Hyperfunctioning becomes identity. Sovereignty allows support without collapse. It allows interdependence without fusion. This is why sovereignty appears later in the arc than agency. Agency reclaims choice. Sovereignty releases the need to guard that choice. You do not need to prove you can stand alone when you trust you will not be erased in connection. Sovereignty versus withdrawal. Withdrawal is the nervous system stepping back to avoid overload. It can be protective, necessary, healing, but it is not sovereignty. Withdrawal reduces contact because contact feels unsafe. It removes stimulation, demand, and unpredictability so the system can recover. Sovereignty does not require removal. A sovereign system remains in contact because contact is no longer inherently destabilizing. It does not seek stimulation, but it does not flee it either. This distinction is critical because many people confuse calm with absence. Dissociation can feel peaceful. Shutdown can feel quiet. Withdrawal can feel controlled. But these states remove sensation to avoid pain. Sovereignty keeps sensation online. You feel more, not less. But feeling no longer triggers defense. From a neurobiological standpoint, withdrawal corresponds to dorsal vagal dominance. Sovereignty corresponds to flexible vagal engagement, the ability to move between states without getting stuck. This flexibility is the hallmark of health. So if presence feels flat, distant, or muted, that is not sovereignty. It is protection. Sovereignty feels alive, responsive, neutral without numbness. Sovereignty versus emotional invulnerability. Perhaps the most seductive myth is that sovereignty means nothing can touch you. This myth arises because defensive or defended nervous systems equate feeling with danger. If emotion led to collapse, betrayal, or overwhelm in the past, the nervous system learns to suppress it. Emotional invulnerability becomes a goal. But invulnerability is not stability. It is avoidance. Sovereignty does not prevent feeling. It prevents overreaction to feeling. You can be hurt without disintegrating. You can be disappointed without armoring. You can be moved without losing center. This capacity emerges only when the nervous system no longer treats emotion as a threat. Emotion moves. Sensation passes. The body remains intact. From a psychological perspective, this is integration. From a somatic perspective, this is the completion of stress cycles. From a mirror-linguistic hypothesis perspective, this is language no longer needing to mask the state. Invulnerability hides. Sovereignty remains. This brings us to the core integration statement that must be held precisely, without metaphor or inflation. You don't protect sovereignty, you stabilize it. Protection implies threat. Stabilization implies resolution. When sovereignty is protected, it is fragile. It must be guarded, asserted, and defended. That is not sovereignty. That is a defended identity. When sovereignty is stabilized, defense relaxes because it is unnecessary. Stabilization occurs through the entire arc that preceded this moment. Stillness taught the system it could stop. Sensation taught it that feeling was safe. Orientation taught it where it was. Discernment taught it what mattered. Boundary taught it to hold the edge without force. Voice taught it to express without performance. Agency taught it to choose without urgency. Reciprocity taught it to share timing. Coherence taught it to participate without splitting. Sovereignty is what emerges when all of those capacities are integrated and no longer need to be monitored. It is not added, it is uncovered. This integration also clarifies why sovereignty cannot be claimed as identity. Identity reintroduces separation. I am sovereign invites defense. I have sovereignty invites loss. Sovereignty is not something you possess. It is a condition that arises when nothing inside you is a contesting presence. This is why sovereignty feels impersonal. It does not belong to you. It is not your achievement. It is the nervous system functioning without threat. That impersonal quality protects sovereignty from being co-opted by ego, ideology, or performance. You are not sovereign over others. You are sovereign with others, or alone, or in conflict, or in silence. Context does not remove it because context no longer defines safety. This integration also dissolves the final fear many people hold unconsciously, that sovereignty will isolate them. In reality, sovereignty removes the need for isolation. When you do not need to protect yourself from contact, you no longer need distance to feel safe. You may still choose solitude, but it is choice, not avoidance. Connection becomes lighter, less effortful, less negotiated. Relationships reorganize naturally around this stability. Some deepen, some fall away. Not because you withdrew, but because the dynamic required defense to function. This is not abandonment, it is accuracy. Sovereignty does not preserve every bond. It preserves integrity, and integrity in this arc is not moral. It is structural. Parts remain connected. Signal remains intact. Presence remains available. That is what this volume has been restoring. Not enlightenment, not empowerment, not mastery, but a nervous system that can inhabit itself in the world without armor. This integration does not close with instructions because there is nothing left to do. If sovereignty is present, it will express itself quietly. If it is absent, it cannot be forced. The work is complete not when you feel sovereign, but when sovereignty no longer needs to be named, and that is how separation dissolves, not by reaching outward, not by pulling away, but by stabilizing presence so thoroughly that distance is no longer required. That is the final integration, not separation, not domination, not independence, not withdrawal, presence without defense. The Return to Self Volume 3 does not end with mastery. It ends with inhabitation. That distinction matters because mastery implies distance. It implies an operator standing above a system, controlling it, refining it, optimizing it. Inhabitation is the opposite movement. It is the return into the system that was abandoned to survive. This final section is not a summary in the conventional sense. It does not catalogue each episode, nor does it attempt to consolidate techniques or lessons. Instead, it traces the movement that has occurred across the arc, the biological logic that has quietly reorganized perception, participation, and self-trust, and allows that movement to settle without escalation, promise, or instruction. Volume 3 was never created or designed to produce a new self. It was designed to end the need to manage one. To understand the return to self, it helps to remember where this entire project began. Volume 1 of the Resonance Matrix mapped the field. It showed how the individual nervous system is not an isolated unit, but a resonant node inside larger acoustic, linguistic, architectural, ancestral, technological, and social matrices. It revealed how we are entrained before we choose, spoken before we speak, and moved before we decide. It dismantled the myth of the autonomous by showing how deeply collective prosody, environmental tone, and inherited survival dialects shape perception and behavior. Volume 2 of the Resonance Matrix then dissected influence. It showed how language becomes biological software, how words act as cognitive hooks and somatic edits, how override is installed not through force, but through precision. It mapped the descent from propaganda to extortion as a progressive collapse of internal reference, where the body's signals are replaced by externally authored urgency. By the end of Volume 2, one thing was clear: the loss of sovereignty is not a moral failure, it is a physiological override. Volume 3 of the Resonance Matrix was the inverse journey, not a climb, not a correction, but a return of signal, from rebuilding signal to inhabiting presence. The early movements of Volume 3 did not attempt to fix the nervous system. They slowed it down enough for the signal to reappear. Stillness was not relaxation, it was the cessation of protective motion. The moment the body stopped moving away from itself, sensation followed not as emotional insight, but as raw interoceptive data, temperature, pressure, rhythm, information that had been muted because it once carried threat. Orientation restored place and time. The nervous system learned again where it was, when it was, and that the present moment was not a replay of the past. These early phases were not about meaning. They were about availability, making the system readable again. From there, discernment re-emerged, the capacity to separate internal signal from external noise, not through analysis, but through felt difference. Boundary followed as the return of the edge without force, an edge that did not require explanation, tension, or performance. Voice came next, not as assertion, but as expression without rehearsal. Sound crosses the boundary because the body no longer needs to protect itself from being heard. Agency then appeared, not as willpower, but as choice without urgency. The nervous system regained the ability to pause, select, and act without being driven by threat timing. None of this required belief. None of it required motivation. Each step emerged because the previous one reduced the cost of being present. By the time Volume 3 entered Phase 3, resonant participation, something fundamental had already shifted. The system no longer needed to prove its existence through reaction. From coherence to being reciprocity, showed that mutual regulation does not require agreement or harmony. It requires timing. Two systems that can pause without collapsing. Two bodies that can influence each other without erasing themselves. Coherence followed as alignment between the internal signal and external action. Not consistency, not certainty. Rhythm, the end of internal contradiction. Participation without splitting. And then sovereignty, not independence, not dominance, not withdrawal, but presence without defense. Sovereignty did not add anything new. It removed the last necessity, the need to prepare for impact. This is the point at which the arc stops moving forward. Because once the body no longer organizes around threat, there is nowhere else to go. There is only inhabitation. The end of the climb many systems promise arrival. Enlightenment, awakening, liberation. These promises keep the nervous system oriented toward a future state, better, safer, purer, which subtly reinstates urgency and comparison. Volume 3 does not offer arrival. It offers settling. Settling is not passive. It is not complacent. It is not resignation. It is the nervous system recognizing that it is no longer being hunted by the past or pulled by an imagined future. Inhabitation means you are no longer standing beside yourself, monitoring, correcting, interpreting. You are in the body that perceives, speaks, chooses, and relates. This is why Volume 3 and the series ends quietly. There is no call to action, no final practice. No mandate to live differently. Any instruction at this point would reintroduce performance. Embodied self-trust is often misunderstood as confidence in decision-making or belief in one's judgment. That is not the trust being restored here. Embodied self-trust is the nervous system's confidence that it can remain present and intact in contact with the world. It is the trust that sensation will not overwhelm, that silence will not destroy the connection, that disagreement will not erase identity, that being seen will not require performance. This trust is not taught, it is not affirmed. It is felt as the absence of bracing, and because it is embodied, it does not need to be defended. No escalation, no promise. This lead-out deliberately avoids promise. No claim that life will now be easier. No assurance that relationships will improve. No suggestion that conflict will disappear. Those promises would be dishonest. What has changed is not the world. It is the cost of being in it. When the nervous system no longer spends energy protecting itself from anticipated harm, more energy becomes available for perception, response, and rest, not as productivity, but as capacity. Some relationships will deepen. Some will fall away. Some environments will feel incompatible. Some choices will become obvious without justification. This is not optimization, it is accuracy. The return to self, the self being returned to here, is not a personality, a narrative, or a moral identity. It is the body, brain, and nervous system, sensing, orienting, responding, without constant interference. This return is not dramatic. Most of the time, it feels ordinary. You notice you are breathing. You notice you are listening. You notice you are responding without rehearsing. Nothing announces completion. That is the point. Volume 3 ends not because there is nothing left to explore, but because exploration itself no longer needs to be framed as a project or a repair. The body has come back online. Welcome back. And for the final time, thank you for entering this field of exploration, the Resonance Matrix, a mirror linguistic hypothesis series. The matrix was never something to escape. It was something to feel, something to perceive from inside the body rather than explain from outside it. Across this volume, the work was not to overcome the system, but to restore the capacity to sense it without being absorbed by it. Volume 3 did not ask you to become more certain. It asked you to become more present, less organized around defense, less governed by urgency, more capable of inhabiting yourself in contact with the world as it is. What has returned here is not authority, not mastery, not a perfected self. What has returned is internal reference, the quiet reliability of a nervous system that no longer needs to prepare for impact to participate. This concludes Volume 3, the Silencing Field Return to Self of the Resonance Matrix series. You have been listening to Episode 10, Sovereignty, Presence Without Defense. I'm James Miller, and this has been the Resonance Matrix Mirror Linguistic Hypothesis series. Goodbye.